vibrant young woman making a fresh start in life.
My sister had a great sense of humor. She was just full of life and ideas and fun. She had a new graphic design job, a new relationship, a new place to live. She was looking to a new future.
Is mercilessly slaughtered in her home.
The person slit her throat.
It was a shocking murder.
Whomever the attacker was extremely disturbed.
You just can't register it. She didn't have any enemies. Everyone loved her.
Investigators tracked down multiple suspects.
There was a creepy guy just watching her.
There was a note that said, saw no signs of life.
Then police discover an enemy in disguise.
They were using other individuals to try to throw us off.
It was a bombshell.
Detectives unmask a killer no one could have imagined.
And I said, what? It didn't make any sense to me.
I was in complete shock.
Gulfport, Florida is an idyllic community, complete with sun, sand, and seaside charm.
Gulfport is kind of a classic southern town. It's kind of an arty community now.
Gulfport has a beautiful beach, and people are very friendly. I never felt unsafe living there.
On May 24th, 1984, Gulfport's laid-back lifestyle is shattered when a disturbing discovery is made.
A woman was checking on her neighbor, and when she didn't answer the door, she viewed inside one of the windows and saw a body laying in a pool of blood. And that's when she called 911.
Homicide detectives are sent to the address in Waterview Park.
Entering into the residence, I noticed broken glass, and I saw the victim's body. There was a copious amount of blood pooling around her head. She looked like she had been hit with a blunt object. There were several stab wounds up and around her neck area, like it was an attack of rage. The victim was partially clothed in a black teddy over a white t-shirt.
It was kind of unusual for someone to wear a teddy on top of their t-shirt. It was unsnapped at the crotch, and so I had suspicions that she was sexually assaulted.
Even though the area was so gory, she had no blood on the soles of her feet. And that was important because you could see bloody footprints, and it appeared to be a barefoot as well.
We surmised that the perpetrator stepped in the blood after the attack was over.
The scene is so bloody, it's not yet clear what exactly happened. The body is sent for autopsy while detectives continue surveying the home.
There was blood on the bed, blood smears on the drapes, and blood on the windowsill.
Possibly the attack started in the bedroom area and then traversed over into the living room.
The trail of blood would indicate that she was fighting throughout. I think she was able to get away from her assailant and run through the house and open the door.
There was some blood and hair on the door, and it looks as though she was stopped, drugged back in, and then finished.
Upon examination of the residence, we couldn't find any type of weapon.
The crime scene was indicative of a very involved struggle, yet there was nothing knocked over or in disarray in the house. Now, it's possible that could actually happen that way, but it's also possible somebody went back in and cleaned it up.
Police speak with the woman who found the body. She tells them the victim is her neighbor, Karen Gregory.
She said the victim's boyfriend, David, was at a conference in Providence, Rhode Island. David had not heard from Karen, and so he called and asked if she would check to see if Karen was okay.
Born in Albany, New York in 1948, 36-year-old Karen Gregory was a loving and kind free spirit.
She was the center of attraction at any gathering, and people just loved her. Karen had a great sense of humor. She was a really good artist, had a great eye. She was a smart woman and very clever and witty and talented.
Karen loved to seek out new places and was always up for an adventure.
She traveled a lot. She would go to Jamaica and explore. And I think her ultimate goal was to go to Jamaica and teach art.
Before Karen can make her dream move, a chance meeting in Florida changes her plans.
And then she met David. David was an interesting character and probably a match for my sister's wit. He was very clever, very intelligent. David was a therapist for PTSD Vietnam vets, and they were just a really good match for each other. They were probably almost a year into the relationship where she had been visiting enough and staying there enough that it was time for her to move in with him. This was a new beginning. She had a new graphic design job, a new relationship, a new place to live, and I think she was looking to a new future. She had just moved in with David the day she was killed.
Who would take away Karen's life in such a horrific manner, and why? Detectives hope clues at the scene will point them to the killer.
Well, we found the Village Voice publication from Providence that struck us as really strange because David was supposed to be up there at the time.
That newspaper actually was dated the day that Karen could have been murdered.
Was David really in Providence, or had he returned? Before detectives can contact David to question him, they find another lead outside.
A note was placed on the car. The context of the note itself was quite telling.
It says, "Came by, I have something for you," but there was no sign of life. Rather brief note. But obviously, the no sign of life would, send up a red flag.
The note is signed by someone named Peter, but there's no other information, so police have no way to track him down. Officers collect the note as evidence, as Karen's family is notified of her death.
The day I got the call was just a beautiful, warm day. This isn't the kind of day that these things happen on. They had found my sister murdered. And I said, what? It didn't make any sense to me. And my mind just went through all of these situations to make that call impossible. And everything will be okay.
Police ask Karen's brother, Roy, about her relationship with David.
Karen's brother indicated that there was a little conflict between Karen and David in that Karen may have had an interest in another individual.
In Jamaica, she met a guy, and then she'd stay longer and longer on these trips. I think she was kind of torn maybe between both realities and both futures.
We also found out that Karen and David had broken up for a length of time before her death.
It wasn't some huge breakup, and she was still moving in, so we assumed everything was going to be worked out. But the weekend she was moving in is the weekend she was killed. The murder was at David's house, and I knew there was a rift there. So I think that added to maybe, well, you just never know.
Could he have flown out to Providence and rebooked a flight back to Gulfport, committed the homicide, and then jumped back on a plane? We have to track down David. We felt that something was there behind the scenes, and we needed to find out about it.
Coming up, investigators discover a series of suspicious men in Karen's circle.
He had been physically abusive to his first wife.
He made Karen feel very uncomfortable.
And scramble to separate friend from foe.
Here we are building on a story that really raising red flags for us.
He's either protecting somebody or he's just flat out lying.
Until finally, the awful truth is revealed.
It makes me sick to my stomach.
No one would have ever thought that this person murdered this woman.
A day after 36-year-old Karen Gregory was brutally murdered in her home, police in Gulfport, Florida suspect her boyfriend, David Mackey, could have killed her, and they need to track him down.
Detectives found out that David was in Albany and that he had flew there to be with the family for the wake and funeral of Karen.
David Mackey seemed to be concerned about Karen, and he wanted to know what was going on. We weren't going to give David the investigative information that we had.
He said that he wasn't going to be back in Florida for another 2 weeks.
David promises to come down to the station when he is back in town. In the interim, investigators sent officers to canvass Karen's street.
Many of the neighbors heard a scream that night. Many got up and looked outside their windows and saw nothing. They didn't know exactly where it came from. Was it kids in a car? I mean, you know, they didn't really know.
The time of the scream was around 1 o'clock in the morning.
There's some thought the time of death was during the scream. She wasn't discovered until midday the day after that.
The head of the neighborhood watch is one of Karen's closest neighbors and a familiar face detectives can rely on.
George Lewis was a Gulfport firefighter, had grown up in Gulfport. All the police officers know him.
George and his wife, Linda, were very good friends with Detective Larry Tossi.
Well, having somebody like George to depend on was very, very comforting in that if something was going on in the neighborhood, he just was that kind of neighborhood watch guy. George said that he was working in his garage, which was across the street from the murder scene. He said he heard a faint scream. He had the radio up loud. He even went out in the street, didn't see anything.
But George did see something the day before Karen's body was found.
George Lewis described seeing this guy pull up in his car and walk up to the door and then write a note and put it on the windshield of one of the cars.
Did George see Peter, the man who wrote that note?
He didn't know Peter Clutt was certainly something that the police wanted to look into because that was the only person they're aware of that went to the house during that time frame.
The next day, as police are figuring out how to track down Peter, they catch a lucky break.
In order to release the remains of the body, Karen's old roommate was asked to identify the victim, and at that time she brought another person with her.
And he identified himself. It was Peter Cumble.
Investigators bring Peter in to answer some questions.
I noticed the scratch on his hand, thinking, you know, maybe it was done by Karen. He noticed me looking at it, so he moved his hand.
They asked him about that, and he said that his dog did it.
Peter confirms to detectives he is the one who left the note for Karen and says he was at the house around 7:30 p.m.
He had been invited to dinner by Karen. They'd known each other for maybe a year. They were both reggae music fans. He was bringing back a music tape, and that's what he was referring to when he said, "I have something of yours."
Not having anybody respond to the knock on the door, he just left the note and left. During the interview, he didn't seem very upset. Portraying that he was such a close friend to Karen, it kind of struck me as being, you know, strange.
Detectives ask where Peter was when Karen was murdered.
Cumble's explanation for where he was that night was he was at home.
He did indicate that his roommate could verify that. He answered the questions, and he was amenable to whatever I asked him to do.
Peter provides police with his fingerprints and footprints, and while they let him go, detectives will keep an eye on him.
We weren't eliminating Peter Cumble from the investigation.
3 days after the murder, police received the medical examiner's report.
Karen had dozens of stab wounds on her. And it wasn't until they had cleaned her up they realized that the person slit her throat. Karen was tortured. The time of death was a day and a half before her body was discovered.
The report also confirms another disturbing fact.
The autopsy determined that a rape was involved.
The medical examiner found semen, but it wasn't enough to make comparison. And DNA at that time was in its infancy.
Thinking about what she went through, it makes me sick to my stomach. You just can't register it. She didn't have any enemies. Everyone loved her.
After 2 weeks out of state, Karen's boyfriend David returns to Florida and is immediately interviewed by detectives.
David was still very upset. He said he loved her and they were getting serious with each other, and that she had finally found what she was looking for in life.
When detectives reveal they know he and Karen had issues, David brushes it off.
He repeated it was all good. They were in love with each other.
David claims the last time he saw Karen was the day he flew out of state.
Karen had driven David to the airport because he had a conference to attend in Providence.
Skeptical, detectives tell David they can place him back at the crime scene.
And I said, we found the Village Voice publication from Providence.
It was dated, and I had a murder here in Gulfport.
He indicated to us he had purchased the Providence publication to check on the weather before he had left.
He told us it was at the newsstand in Gulfport a couple of days prior to the homicide. We have to look into that.
Detectives ask David point blank if he murdered his girlfriend.
He became frustrated, in my opinion, that we'd be looking at him instead of spending time looking for the real killer.
He was pretty adamant in the fact that he was off doing a conference in Providence and he hadn't gone anywhere. He said, I want to be as much of a help rather than a hindrance as I can. He was also asked to submit foot samples, which he did as well.
When asked who might want to kill his girlfriend, David gives a name detectives recognize.
David informed us that he felt that Peter Cumble had some kind of an interest in Karen.
It became clear that David was trying to blame this on Peter Cumble.
Police are investigating the grisly murder of Karen Gregory. Her boyfriend, David Mackey, denies being involved and points detectives towards Peter Cumble, a man police have already questioned and released.
In David's mind, he felt that Cumble was someone who had an interest in Karen, like as a potential girlfriend. David wasn't aware of anything about Cumble being invited to dinner and really probably had no real reason to see why Cumble would come by the house while he was gone. He said that Cumble was an acquaintance, but not a close friend. They knew people in the same circles.
Peter Cumble was always calling Karen up and that he felt he was going to try to develop a relationship with her, and Karen obviously wouldn't have anything to do with it.
David was concerned that Cumble could be involved, and they needed to look at him closely.
With nothing concrete to link David to the murder, they let him go. Detectives now need to confirm his claim that Peter had ulterior motives around Karen. When police try to bring Peter in for another interview, they hit a problem.
He had left Gulfport right after his first interview.
He had went on vacation, and the detectives found that strange, that him being close to Karen Gregory, that he would leave and go on vacation after her death.
Without the evidence to compel Peter to return, investigators switch gears and delve deeper into David Mackey's alibi. David had told police he had given a presentation in Providence at 9 a.m. on May 23rd, which would have been 8 hours after Karen was killed.
Was it possible for him to have got on a flight, come down, murdered Karen, and got back up to Rhode Island?
Detective Sergeant Tossi decided to take flights in the same time frame.
I found that he could have committed the murder and get back in time and do his presentation. It would have been tight, but it's possible.
Detectives subpoena David's credit card information, but they show no record of David buying any additional flights. David's story about the newspaper also appears to check out.
It was discovered that the paper actually comes out 2 days early, and the gentleman remembered selling the paper to David Mackey. David was telling the truth, and his alibi was solid.
As weeks pass without an arrest, Karen's friends and family become concerned.
Not knowing why or who or how this even happened, you're left with all these questions. The grief was too heavy. There was just a lot of weeping for a long time. Just the slightest little memory of her or thought of her. I can weep right now thinking about that.
For such a small town, it was a shocking murder. I can only imagine what some of the women that lived alone in that community felt when there is a killer out there and they haven't been caught.
A few weeks into the investigation, detectives get a boost when potential suspect Peter Cumble arrives back in town.
He looked a little bit disheveled. He looked a little bit shaky, as if he didn't want to be there type of an attitude.
Detectives cut to the chase and ask Peter if he killed Karen Gregory.
He was completely shocked.
Cumble's alibi was he was at home.
But with David pointing the finger at Peter, detectives need to follow up.
He was pretty adamant in the fact that, he hadn't gone anywhere and the roommate could be his alibi witness. Anybody can say they're home and they're in bed. In the middle of the night, they can go out and do what they want to do. And that's a very shaky and unsubstantiated alibi. We didn't have much to hold him at that point, so he left.
Needing something concrete to tie Peter to the murder, investigators hope his footprint sample matches the one found at the scene.
There was a partial bloody footprint on the floor. We did send it off to the sheriff's office. And we waited quite a period of time, and then we heard back that they couldn't find any identifying ridges or swirls.
It's a big disappointment to me that our sheriff's office couldn't make a match.
Detectives refuse to give up.
The photograph of the bloody footprint looks mostly like a smear. So it was sent to Washington for the FBI to look at, which was not uncommon practice, especially if you had something that might be difficult for a local person to do.
The analysis won't be fast, so investigators go back through everything collected at the scene and find a potential piece of evidence.
There was a schematic drawing of a clock.
It appeared to have a blood stain on it. Did the murderer bring that with him and leave that there, forgetting about it? Did he get blood on it while this happened? So it looked like a pretty good clue they needed to follow up on. They were able to determine that these were schematics that had been drawn by Stephen Fischler, who was someone that Karen worked with.
Detectives send the blood on the drawing in for testing, and when they look into Stephen Fischler, they discover something troubling.
We found out from female workers that they felt uncomfortable around him, that he showed the girls pornography, and they took offense.
They indicated they were afraid of him.
According to one friend, Stephen Fischler made Karen feel very uncomfortable many times. He made unwanted advances. At one time, he gave her a provocative novel that he was writing.
Fischler, as far as the way he behaved in the office around women, he was a suspect.
We decided that we needed to have an extensive interview with Stephen Fischler. Stephen Fischler had kind of a defensive attitude. He was curt.
He said that they didn't really know each other. He and Karen had seen each other at work, but she had only been working there a short period of time.
When Stephen was questioned about the schematic, he had no explanation for how it got into her house, other than she probably took it home with her.
Detectives grill Stephen about his reputation among his coworkers.
And he became angry. He said, I had no idea.
We asked him if we'd take a polygraph test. He agreed to do that. Stephen didn't really want to answer the questions. He was extremely frustrated.
Just when investigators think they won't get anything out of him, Stephen says something truly shocking.
During the polygraph, he blurted out, "Okay, I did it."
Everybody thought, well, heck, this guy is confessing.
Two months after Karen Gregory is viciously slaughtered in her home, her coworker Stephen Fischler has just confessed to police.
It was unexpected. Was he really telling the truth?
Police immediately begin to press Stephen for details behind his confession.
We determined that after talking with Stephen, that he blurted out, "Okay, I did it," just out of frustration.
He was angry because he was being accused of this murder. And that was just his personality and his temperament.
Stephen retracts his confession and proceeds with the polygraph.
He passed the polygraph. It showed no deception indicated.
The result was totally unexpected to us. It basically cleared Fischler.
But Stephen's not off the suspect list just yet. He refuses to provide a footprint sample, so police must wait for the results from the schematic drawing to see if any foreign blood is detected.
In this case, the blood was clearly all her blood, and it wasn't Stephen Fischler's. There was a lot of frustration. They had kind of hit a dead end.
Running out of suspects, investigators switch up their approach and put together a behavioral analysis profile of the killer.
You're trying to look at, what causes people to do what they might do.
It wasn't your general whodunit. Whomever the attacker was extremely disturbed. He was the type of individual that had various fantasies, sexual fantasies, which drove him to commit the murder of Karen Gregory.
Maybe this was a serial killer, which kind of fits into that whole psychological pattern to some degree.
It was probably the most difficult case that I had to deal with. 5 months down the road from the homicide, I just couldn't let the case go, couldn't put it on the shelf.
For Karen's family, coping with the reality that her killer may never be found is overwhelming.
We kind of thought they're never going to solve this, which was just alarming to us. And that's another whole kind of pain that was a nightmare. She was a sweet, wonderful young woman. And the killer was a brute, who butchered her.
Finally, a break comes in December, 5 months after the murder, when detectives make a discovery that revitalizes the case.
Tassi was talking to a person who lived a few blocks away from Karen, and that person told him they had heard the scream. She described it as just a wail, and that it was very disturbing. Tassi was like, he didn't realize it was really that loud that actually over 2 or 3 blocks people heard this.
This new information is in direct conflict with the statements of the neighborhood watch head.
And she's several blocks away and she hears the scream, and George is right across the street. How come he didn't hear more than what he said was a faint scream? It didn't make any sense. So we figured we better have another talk with George, which we did.
Detective Tassi, he looked at George as a helper to the police case. George was a firefighter, the neighborhood watch guy that was actively out there.
When we went over his story, he indicated that he had heard the scream, and that he walked to the edge of his driveway, looked around and didn't see anything.
Now, George adds a new detail to his account.
Now he sees somebody on the lawn under the big oak tree.
This story was quite a surprise. Why didn't he report it? Why didn't he call?
He didn't really know what to say. I think in many ways he sounded nervous.
George describes the person he saw the night of the murder.
He said he was like 6'4" and had red sandy hair. He was a big, strong-looking guy. It was certainly something that the police wanted to look into.
Armed with the new information, detectives try to track down this mysterious man.
And in doing extensive neighborhood interviews, it was related to us there may be a peeping Tom in the area that fit. We thought, well, we may have something to go on here.
I interviewed one person, and she said that she had a peeping Tom at her window. And when she noticed him, he took off.
Could the peeping Tom be the killer police have been looking for? Investigators show George pictures of possible prowlers.
He couldn't identify any of them. So the mystery man in the lawn remained unidentified.
So there's some thought that he might have been watching that house and watching her and knew that she was alone that night and knew David was out of town.
I felt terrified, especially at night. I kept my doors locked. I didn't want to end up like her.
Detectives find another woman in the neighborhood who recently saw the prowler.
There was a creepy guy just watching her for some unknown reason.
She caught him peeping in the window, and he took off.
The woman recognized the man. When she tells police his name, they're stunned.
It was a big surprise.
Detectives hunting for Karen Gregory's killer learn there's a prowler stalking the women of Gulfport, Florida. Could the offender be one and the same? When a victim of the voyeur comes forward with a name, investigators are shocked.
It's the neighbor, George Lewis.
It was totally unexpected to us.
Detectives bring George in for a third time and ask him about the woman's claims.
He admitted he was outside the house, and he had some explanation for why he was there. He was a neighborhood watch guy and always looking out for people. He said he heard a noise or something. They thought, you know, is it possible it's the killer?
He was given the opportunity to take a polygraph test, which he did.
Detectives start by asking about the prowler.
Listening to the polygraph tape and how George Lewis described the man, I really believed him.
Investigators also ask him about the night of the murder.
Did you kill Karen Gregory? George said no.
The polygraph results tell a different story.
The results were disastrous. He failed it miserably.
After he failed it, he had something else to say about the night of the murder.
George admits he hasn't been completely honest and tells police that's why he didn't pass the polygraph.
George Lewis indicated to us the individual that he saw on the lawn left Karen's house itself. He saw George and had approached him and threatened him.
The person walks out and tells him, if you say you saw me here, I'll come back and kill you.
So that's the reason he wasn't forthcoming. He was afraid of him. George Lewis went from just hearing a scream at the edge of his driveway to indicating that he saw the perpetrator.
And then his next story, George said this guy threatened him.
We were very concerned about that because here we are building on a story, so it really raised red flags for us. We felt that, you know, with the abundance of different issues and stories he was telling, he was using other individuals to try to throw us off. We had asked him to do a composite sketch of the individual that he saw. After the sketch was done, we both looked at each other and said, this really can't be happening. We both came to the conclusion it was George when he was younger.
I think he thought the police had a witness who saw somebody in Karen's yard. So he was making this description of the person who scared him get closer and closer to looking like him.
He's either protecting somebody that he knows, or he's just flat out lying. We have to look at George a little closer.
Investigators collect his foot and fingerprints, but with little hard evidence to hold him, George is released. Detectives take a deep dive into George's past and make some disturbing discoveries.
He had been physically abusive to his first wife.
According to her, there were times when he had been violent with her. He had choked her. The crime itself shows some pretty deep-seated violence towards women, and I think there was aspects in his background where you could see that.
George had gotten into a swingers club. That was a part of George I never really saw, you know, or never knew. He's never said anything like that to me. So that was kind of surprising, but things were building up with him and his behavior.
It appears George developed a troubling fascination with Karen before she had even moved in.
One of George's friends told me that Karen was visiting over at David's house. Karen had come out in a bikini, and he made some comment about liking to have an orgy with her. Got aroused. He had gotten into sexual perversions, if you will.
I think there was indications that he was, a peeper of some sort.
Still looking for hard proof, detectives asked George's wife about the night of the murder.
She was woken by the scream. After just a few minutes, George came in from the garage.
The killer would have been covered in blood, but George wasn't.
When you sit back and you look at these things, because you say to yourself, oh, well, maybe he really didn't do it. Maybe his story makes sense. Or maybe he's covering up for somebody that did do it, you know what I mean?
And so now it's, where do we go from here?
At that time, we didn't have, DNA. The only thing that could tie itself into the case was the footprints.
Detectives are still waiting for those results.
It was getting extremely, extremely frustrating for the team.
And then the months just went by, nothing happened.
It seemed like it was just going to be a cold case. And it's like, well, what are we supposed to do with that? You can't just stop here, but they didn't have leads. They didn't know where to go with it. This is about my sister being butchered to death. We were not going to rest till they found who the killer was.
In March 1986, almost 2 years after Karen's murder, the FBI finally finished their analysis on the bloody footprint at the crime scene.
The day that the data came back from the FBI, everybody was elated.
It showed the ridges on the heel from the bare foot, and they can be identified, compare one to someone else.
Detectives have renewed hope the killer is within their reach.
We must have sent 20 sets of footprints.
And they got a result on that relatively quick, which changed the whole case.
A definite match.
No one in Gulfport would have ever thought that this person murdered this woman.
Nearly 2 years since the brutal slaying of Karen Gregory, detectives have just received a report back on the bloody footprint found at the crime scene.
The footprint was sent to the FBI. We were waiting specifically on just that result.
There was a definite match of a footprint of George Lewis to the inked footprint that we had sent up there to the FBI lab.
It was shocking.
It was very hard for me to believe that George Lewis murdered Karen Gregory. He was the head of the crime watch. He was a firefighter. I was in complete shock.
Although no one could believe George was a cold-blooded killer, the evidence doesn't lie.
Footprints with their ridges and their swirls are similar to fingerprints. If you have enough of those patterns to present to a match, then they're just as good.
I didn't want to believe it, and I had to face that. I trusted George. He was toying with me. He certainly wasn't the person that I thought he was.
The detective knows he has to ask his old friend some tough questions.
We asked him to come into the station, and that's when we confronted him with the footprint. That's when he said, I crawled in the window.
It was a bombshell. Now here's a whole new story where he's absolutely in the
indicated that he had heard the scream. He had gone through the bedroom window to try to assist Karen.
He said that he saw her laying there with her throat cut open. Only the killer would have known that her throat was cut.
He said he had stepped in the blood to assist her or help her, and then he had exited out through the bedroom window.
His explanations didn't make sense. If you assume that his story is true, that he was threatened by this person in the yard and was too scared to do anything about it, then why would he go into the house?
Why didn't he call police at that time?
His story is BS, but the nail in the coffin, of course, was the footprint.
Investigators also talked to George's wife again, and they learned he would have had time to clean up after the crime.
His wife had been very defensive of him, and she changed the story. George was gone for the longest time, she said, 20 minutes or more.
We don't have to prove motive. We felt we had enough probable cause then to make an arrest.
I had mixed feelings. I was sorry it was George, but yet I was a little upset that he just let us on.
Nearly 2 years after Karen's brutal murder, on March 15th, 1986, George is charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery.
It was a huge relief that they had finally found someone, but it was a shock, just a shock, and still no reason. Why would a neighbor do this?
I think in looking at him, it was pretty clear that he had a fairly misogynistic view towards women. He thought she might be an easy mark or an easy target.
At trial, investigators put forward their theory about how the murder unfolded.
George Lewis would have gone over knowing that David was out of town. He came in the house, knifed, and ready to do it, and was living out a fantasy. Teddy had been put on her against her will.
She knew that the only way to get away was fight to get out of that residence.
She was pushed and hit her head against the jalousie windows. That's when she screamed. After that, it got really violent. The rape was involved.
Lewis knew then that he had only one way to go with this, and as a result, he ends up stabbing Karen 21 times.
George Lewis maintains his innocence, but a jury convicts him, and he is sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
No one ever really wants to believe that someone that is there to protect and to serve could do something so horrible.
This was really unexpected that he was the killer. That didn't seem like who I would expect a firefighter to be, and certainly not the neighborhood watch guy. Although maybe he was watching for opportunities.
I was relieved we could actually get justice for Karen and all the people who loved her.
There was a little bit of justice in knowing he was in jail. My sister probably would have forgiven him. That's the kind of person she was. It's funny sitting here now. She was alive for as many years as she's now been gone. She never lived, we never got to know who she'd be as an old lady. She was just full of life and ideas and fun and humor. I have her ring on right now that she made for me. Karen and I were really close. And I'll always miss that. And I'll just never forget her.
Bring a nigga from the 9-1. Switch that over, that's the young blonde. I was at the West Coast, now I'm in the East Coast. Shawty wanna fuck.